The morning sun cast golden rays across what many consider the most beautiful yard in Willowbrook subdivision, and 74-year-old Joe Henderson stood on his back porch with his steaming coffee mug, surveying his life's work with quiet satisfaction. Every blade of Kentucky bluegrass stood at precisely 2.5 inches, creating a carpet so perfect it looked like something from a magazine cover. The rose garden along the eastern fence displayed 37 varieties in full bloom, their intoxicating fragrance carried by the gentle breeze that rustled through the ancient oak tree he planted the day his granddaughter was born. 43 years, Joe murmured to himself, watching a cardinal land on the bird bath he crafted from Tennessee marble. 43 years of 5 a.m. waterings, weekend soil amendments, and the kind of meticulous care that transformed ordinary earth into something extraordinary. His neighbors often joked that NASA could probably see his yard from space, and Joe took that as the highest compliment. The Hendersons had moved to Willowbrook when the subdivision was nothing but dirt roads and dreams, back when Joe still had dark hair and his late wife, Martha, could spend entire afternoons helping him plant bulbs and trim hedges. Now, with Martha 5 years gone and his son's family living 3 states away, the yard had become more than just landscaping. It was his cathedral, his daily meditation, his living memorial to a lifetime of love and dedication. But this morning, something was different. Something that made Joe's weathered hands tighten around his coffee mug until his knuckles went white. There, scattered across his immaculate lawn like confetti after a tornado, lay trash. Not just any trash. Food containers, beer bottles, cigarette butts, and what appeared to be the contents of someone's car ashtray, all thrown carelessly over the 6-foot privacy fence that separated his property from the Blackwells next door. Joe set down his coffee with deliberate calm, the same way he'd set down his tools during his 30 years as a mechanical engineer when a problem required his full attention. He descended the porch steps slowly, his morning routine forgotten, and walked across his violated sanctuary to examine the evidence. The greasy pizza box had landed squarely on his prize-winning dailies. 3 beer bottles were scattered near the fountain where he'd spread his wife's ashes. Cigarette butts dotted the pathway he'd laid stone by stone, each one carefully selected and positioned during the summer of '98. But it was the sight of the crushed aluminum sitting atop Martha's favorite peony bush that made something shift deep in Joe's chest, a familiar feeling he hadn't experienced since his army days in Vietnam, when respect wasn't just expected, it was demanded. The Blackwells had moved in 6 months ago, a family in their 30s with 2 teenage boys who seemed to believe the world revolved around their convenience. Joe had welcomed them with homemade cookies and an offer to help with anything they needed. He even lent them his hedge trimmer when theirs broke, though it came back with a bent blade and no explanation. Standing in his desecrated garden, surrounded by the debris of someone else's disrespect, Joe Henderson felt something awaken that had been dormant for decades. It wasn't anger. Anger was hot and quick and foolish. This was something cooler, more patient, more dangerous. This was the methodical precision of a man who spent his life solving problems, combined with the unwavering principles of someone who understood that actions had consequences. As he began collecting the trash piece by piece, Joe's mind was already working, calculating, planning. The Blackwells had just declared war on the wrong neighbor. Joe Henderson had always believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt, a philosophy that had served him well through 7 decades of life. Perhaps the trash incident was a mistake. Teenagers being careless, wind-catching garbage from an overfilled bin, an honest accident that reasonable neighbors could resolve with a simple conversation. So that afternoon, after spending 3 hours picking debris from his flower beds and replanting the damaged dailies, Joe walked to the Blackwells' front door with the measured steps of a man seeking peaceful resolution. The house that answered his knock was a study in neglect. Paint peeled from the shutters, weeds choked the flower beds that the previous owners had maintained beautifully, and a collection of Amazon boxes sat soggy and forgotten on the porch. When the door finally opened, Rick Blackwell appeared in a stained undershirt, a beer in one hand, and annoyance written across his face like a warning label. "What?" Rick's greeting held all the warmth of a January morning. "Good afternoon, Mr. Blackwell," Joe began, his voice carrying the patient politeness he perfected during decades of dealing with difficult clients. "I'm Joe Henderson, your neighbor from next door. I wanted to speak with you about some trash that ended up in my yard this morning." Rick's expression shifted from annoyance to something closer to amusement. "Trash? In your precious perfect yard?" He took a long swig of beer and shrugged. "Wind blows, old man. Stuff moves around. That's life." Joe felt his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "The items appeared to be deliberately thrown over our shared fence. I'm sure it was just a misunderstanding, but I wanted to make sure it doesn't happen again. I spent many years—" "Look, Grandpa," Rick interrupted, leaning against his doorframe with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never faced real consequences. "I got better things to do than worry about every little piece of paper that blows into your yard. Maybe you should worry less about your flowers and more about getting a life. The door slammed shut with enough force to rattle the frame, leaving Joe standing on the porch with his hands clenched at his sides. Behind him, he could hear Rick's voice through the thin walls. That crazy old coot next door is whining about trash in his yard. Can you believe that? The laughter that followed, Rick's voice joined by what sounded like his wife Linda, hit Joe like a physical blow. In 43 years of living in Willowbrook, he'd never encountered such blatant disrespect. Even during the worst neighbor disputes, people maintained basic civility, but the Blackwells seemed to operate by different rules entirely. But in the following weeks, you'll learn just how different those rules were. The trash throwing wasn't an accident. It was the opening salvo in what appeared to be the Blackwells' campaign to make their neighbors' lives miserable. Every few days brought new violations. Fast food containers sailed over the fence during their backyard barbecues, cigarette butts were flicked directly onto Joe's rose bushes, and on one memorable Sunday morning, an entire bag of garbage was dumped over the fence while Joe was at church. But it wasn't just the trash. The Blackwells seemed to take perverse pleasure in testing every boundary of neighborhood etiquette. Their music thumped until well past midnight on weeknights, their teenage sons revved their motorcycles at 6 a.m. on weekends, and their parties grew louder and more frequent, spilling into Joe's once peaceful evenings with drunken shouting and the crash of breaking bottles. Joe tried everything a reasonable man could try. He called the Homeowners Association only to discover that the Blackwells had somehow gotten themselves elected to the board the month before his complaint. He contacted the city about noise ordinances, but the single warning citations seemed to only encourage their behavior. He even attempted to speak with Linda Blackwell when he saw her at the grocery store, hoping that perhaps she might be more reasonable than her husband. "Oh, you're the yard guy," Linda had said with a laugh that held no warmth. "Rick told me about you. Listen, sweetie, maybe it's time you realize that not everyone wants to live in a museum. This is suburbia, not some fancy garden club." The final straw came on a Saturday morning in late spring when Joe discovered that the Blackwells had done something so outrageous, so deliberately destructive, that even his infinite patience finally snapped. He stood at his back door, coffee forgotten in his hand, staring at the devastation in his yard with the same expression he worn 50 years earlier when his platoon had discovered their camp destroyed by enemy fire. This time, they had gone too far. This time, Joe Henderson was done playing defense. The scene that greeted Joe that Saturday morning looked like a war zone disguised as a garden. What had taken him 43 years to build and nurture had been destroyed in a single night of malicious vandalism that went far beyond careless trash throwing. The Blackwells hadn't just crossed a line, they had obliterated it with the thoroughness of people who had mistaken an old man's patience for weakness. Paint, gallons of it in garish orange and purple streaks, had been poured over his prized roses, coating the delicate petals in toxic sludge that was already causing the leaves to curl and blacken. The ancient oak tree that had sheltered 3 generations of cardinals now bore the scars of what appeared to be paintball target practice, its noble trunk pockmarked with fluorescent splashes that dripped like wounds onto the pristine grass below. But it was Martha's memorial garden that broke something fundamental inside Joe's chest. The small corner where he planted her favorite white roses in the shape of a heart, where he came every evening to tell her about his day, had been turned into a dumping ground for what looked like an entire home renovation project. Broken drywall, bent nails, empty paint cans, and chunks of concrete were piled high on the sacred ground where Martha's ashes had been scattered 5 years ago. Joe walked through the devastation with the measured steps of a man conducting a military inspection, cataloging each act of destruction with a methodical precision that had made him one of the most respected engineers in his field. His hands, steady despite his 74 years, took photographs with his phone, evidence that would have made his old Army intelligence unit proud. The sound of laughter from next door made him look up. Through a gap in the fence, he could see Rick Blackwell on his back patio, beer in hand at 9 in the morning, gesturing toward Joe's yard while talking to someone on his phone. The words carried clearly across the morning air. "You should see it, man. The old coot's face is priceless. 40 years of playing in the dirt, gone in one night." Rick's laughter was the sound of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. "Guy thinks he's better than everyone else with his perfect little garden. Well, not so perfect now, is it?" Joe heard every word, filed it away with the same clinical detachment he'd once used to assess enemy positions. The Rick Blackwells of the world always made the same mistake. They assumed that quiet people were weak people, that patience was synonymous with powerlessness. In Joe's experience, they were invariably wrong. That afternoon, while the Blackwells were out, probably at Home Depot, buying more supplies for their reign of terror, Joe made his first reconnaissance mission. The 6-foot privacy fence that separated their properties had a loose board that he'd noticed months ago but never bothered to fix. Now that oversight proved fortuitous. What he discovered in the Blackwells' backyard was exactly what he expected. a monument to laziness and disrespect. Their lawn was a patchwork of dead grass and bare dirt, littered with the detritus of people who treated their living space like a dumpster. Broken lawn furniture, bags of garbage that had split open and spilled their contents, a rusted barbecue grill that looked like it hadn't been cleaned since the Clinton administration. But there, in the far corner of their neglected yard, Joe found something that made his engineer's mind start calculating possibilities. The Blackwells had what they probably thought was a beautiful feature, a small pond with a fountain, surrounded by expensive-looking outdoor furniture and a built-in barbecue area that had clearly cost thousands of dollars. Their backyard oasis, as she heard Linda call it during one of her loud phone conversations. It was the one thing they actually cared about, the one corner of their property that showed any sign of investment or pride. Joe studied it with the same intensity he'd once brought to analyzing bridge load calculations, noting the electrical connections, the water circulation system, the carefully arranged stonework that probably represented the Blackwells' entire aesthetic sensibility. Standing there in the growing shadows of evening, surrounded by the evidence of his life's work destroyed and his wife's memory desecrated, Joe Henderson felt something click into place in his mind. The same sensation he'd experienced decades ago when a particularly complex engineering problem suddenly revealed its solution. The Blackwells had taught him an important lesson about modern warfare. Sometimes diplomacy wasn't enough. Sometimes people only understood the language of consequences. And Joe Henderson, retired Army engineer with 4 decades of problem-solving experience, was about to become fluent in that language. As he walked back to his own yard, stepping carefully around the paint-splattered roses and construction debris, Joe was already designing his response. It would be elegant, it would be thorough, and it would be absolutely completely legal. The Blackwells wanted to play games with a man who had spent his career building bridges and designing systems that had to work perfectly the first time. They were about to discover that some games had very serious rules. Joe Henderson spent the next 3 weeks living a double life. To his neighbors, he appeared to be the same defeated old man who cleaned up trash every morning and replanted his damaged flowers with quiet resignation. But in the privacy of his workshop, a meticulously organized space in his basement that looked like a cross between a laboratory and a military command center, Joe was orchestrating what would become known in Willowbrook subdivision as the Great Redistribution. The plan was born from a simple engineering principle. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. The Blackwells had spent months dumping their problems onto his property. Joe was going to return the favor with the precision of a Swiss watch and the inevitability of gravity. Phase 1 required documentation. Using a camera with a telephoto lens that he bought for bird watching, Joe photographed every piece of trash that appeared in his yard, noting the time, weather conditions, and trajectory analysis that would make a ballistics expert proud. He collected every item and labeled evidence bags the way his army training had taught him to process intelligence. Pizza boxes from Tony's downtown, the Blackwells' Friday night ritual. Beer bottles from the same brand Rick favored, cigarette butts that matched the ones Linda smoked during her morning coffee on the patio. But documentation was just the foundation. The real genius lay in Joe's understanding of human psychology combined with his engineer's grasp of mechanical systems. The Blackwells had one weakness: their beloved backyard oasis. They treated it like their personal paradise, hosting elaborate parties where they could show off their expensive furniture and imported stone fountain. It was their pride, their joy, and their Achilles heel. Phase 2 involved procurement, and Joe approached it with the methodical precision of a military quartermaster. He rented a small storage unit across town, paying cash and using his middle name to keep things discreet. Over the course of 2 weeks, he filled it with supplies that would have puzzled anyone who didn't understand the scope of his operation. Industrial-grade tarps, a portable generator, several lengths of PVC pipe, a collection of timer-controlled mechanisms that he ordered from various online retailers, and most importantly, a custom-built catapult system that represented the pinnacle of his engineering career. The catapult was Joe's masterpiece, a scaled-up version of the trebuchet he'd built for his granddaughter's science fair project years earlier. Constructed from aluminum tubing and powered by a system of counterweights and springs, it could accurately deliver a payload of up to 15 pounds across a distance of exactly 67 feet, the precise measurement from his workshop window to the center of the Blackwells' backyard oasis. But the delivery system was only part of the equation. Joe's real stroke of genius lay in the timing mechanism he designed, a marvel of microengineering that would coordinate multiple events with the precision of a symphony conductor. Every piece of trash the Blackwells had thrown into his yard over the past 6 months was going to be returned to them in a manner that would demonstrate the true meaning of consequences. Phase 3 required patience and surveillance. Joe studied the Blackwells' patterns with the dedication of a wildlife researcher. Rick left for work every weekday at 7:15 a.m., stopped at the gas station for coffee and lottery tickets, and returned by 6:30 p.m. unless it was Friday when he hit the local sports bar. Linda worked part-time at a boutique downtown, left at 9:45 a.m. on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and spent most afternoons on her patio talking loudly on her phone about people who didn't know their place. The teenagers followed predictable patterns too: school until 3:15, and either video games in the basement or motorcycle rides that disturbed the entire neighborhood. But most importantly, Joe identified their vulnerability window every Saturday morning from 8 a.m. to 11 a.m., when the entire family went to Linda's mother's house for what she called mandatory family torture time. The weekend Joe chose for Operation Redistribution was perfect: clear skies, minimal wind, and a 3-day holiday weekend that meant the Blackwells would be hosting one of their infamous backyard parties on Sunday. They would have a full house of guests to witness the fruits of their months of neighborhood terrorism. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of pristine weather that made Joe think Martha was watching over him from wherever she'd gone. At exactly 8:05 a.m., he watched the Blackwells' SUV disappear around the corner, leaving their house empty and their backyard oasis undefended. Joe moved with the efficiency of a man half his age, wheeling his equipment from the storage unit to his workshop on a custom-built cart that made no sound on his concrete driveway. The catapult assembly took exactly 12 minutes. He practiced it 17 times to ensure smooth operation. The timer mechanisms were synchronized and tested, each one calibrated to activate at precisely calculated intervals. At 8:47 a.m., Joe Henderson initiated the most elaborate act of neighborhood justice in Willowbrook's history. The first payload, a carefully wrapped collection of pizza boxes, beer bottles, and cigarette butts that the Blackwells had deposited in his rose garden, arced gracefully through the morning air and landed with a satisfying splash in the center of their imported stone fountain. But that was just the opening salvo. Joe had engineered a system that would continue the redistribution process for the next 2 hours and 13 minutes, returning 6 months' worth of disrespect with compound interest. Each timer activation would send another precisely calculated payload into their backyard oasis, transforming their pride and joy into a monument to their own behavior. As Joe sat in his workshop monitoring the automated sequence through his telephoto lens, he allowed himself a small smile. The Blackwells had taught him that some people only understood consequences. He was about to provide them with a graduate-level education in cause and effect. The Blackwells returned home at 10:53 a.m. to discover that their backyard oasis had been transformed into what could only be described as an archaeological dig of their own bad behavior. 6 months of accumulated disrespect had been returned to them with the precision of a Federal Express delivery and the artistry of a master sculptor. Joe watched through his telephoto lens as Rick Blackwell stood frozen on his back patio, mouth agape, staring at the fountain that now contained every pizza box, beer bottle, and cigarette butt he'd thrown over the fence since moving to Willowbrook. The expensive outdoor furniture was decorated with paint cans, the same ones they dumped in Martha's memorial garden, while construction debris had been arranged in neat piles around their imported stonework like some sort of avant-garde art installation. But the piece de resistance was the final payload, which had activated just minutes before their return. A large banner made from one of their own garbage bags, stretched between 2 stakes and reading "Return to Send-DR" in letters cut from duct tape. It fluttered in the morning breeze like a flag of surrender. Linda Blackwell's shriek could be heard 3 houses away. "What the hell happened to our patio?" she screamed, her voice carrying the outrage of someone who had never experienced consequences for her actions. "Who did this? How did all this garbage get in our yard?" Rick was already pulling out his phone, no doubt to call the police, when Joe decided it was time for the final phase of his operation. He walked calmly to his back fence, still holding his coffee mug, and peered through the gap in the boards with the innocent curiosity of a neighbor wondering about all the commotion. "Morning, folks," Joe called out pleasantly. "Everything all right over there? Sounds like you're having some kind of problem." Rick spun around, his face purple with rage. You did this. You put all this trash in our yard." Joe examined the scene with the detached interest of a man discovering something fascinating. "Well, I'll be darned. That does look like quite a mess. You know, some of that stuff looks familiar. Didn't I see similar items in my yard over the past few months?" He paused, taking a thoughtful sip of coffee. "Funny how things have a way of finding their way home, isn't it?" "This is vandalism," Linda shouted, pointing at Joe with a shaking finger. "We're calling the police." "That's probably a good idea," Joe agreed amiably. "I'm sure they'll be very interested in conducting a thorough investigation. I've got quite a bit of documentation myself: photographs, timestamps, trajectory analysis. Been keeping detailed records ever since trash started appearing in my yard. Fascinating stuff, really. Did you know that pizza boxes from Tony's downtown have a distinctive grease pattern that makes them easy to identify even weeks later?" The look that passed between Rick and Linda was worth 6 months of humiliation. It was the expression of people who had suddenly realized they were in a chess match with someone who had been thinking several moves ahead while they were still playing checkers. "You can't prove anything," Rick said, but his voice had lost its earlier bluster. Joe smiled with the patience of a man who had spent his career solving problems that had no margin for error. "Well, that's the beautiful thing about evidence, Mr. Blackwell. It tends to speak for itself. But you know what? I'm not really interested in proving anything. I'm just a simple man who believes in treating neighbors with respect." He gestured toward the destruction in their yard with the casual air of someone pointing out interesting cloud formations. "This looks like quite a cleanup job you got ahead of you. Probably take most of the weekend, I guess. Shame, too. What with your big party planned for tomorrow?" The party. In all their outrage, the Blackwells had forgotten about the elaborate barbecue they'd been planning for Sunday, complete with Linda's book club friends and Rick's poker buddies, all the people they'd been bragging to about putting the crazy old man next door in his place. Over the next hour, Joe watched from his workshop as the Blackwells frantically tried to clean up their backyard before their guests arrived. But 6 months of systematically distributed karma wasn't something that could be fixed with a trash bag and a garden hose. The paint had stained their expensive furniture, the fountain pump had clogged with debris, and their pristine stonework bore the permanent scars of their own behavior. By Sunday afternoon, word had spread throughout the neighborhood about the Blackwells' mysterious yard problem. People who had been quietly enduring months of noise, disrespect, and general inconsideration suddenly found their voices. Property managers received formal complaints, the Homeowners Association mysteriously discovered multiple violations they'd somehow missed before, and the Blackwells found themselves on the receiving end of the same treatment they'd been dishing out to others. The final vindication came 3 weeks later when Joe noticed a for sale sign appearing in the Blackwells' front yard. Rick approached him one evening as he was watering his roses, new ones planted where the paint-damaged flowers had been removed. "We're moving," Rick said without preamble, his earlier arrogance replaced by something that might have been respect or at least wariness. Joe looked up from his watering, his expression mild. "That's probably for the best. Fresh start and all that." "Look," Rick continued, clearly struggling with words he'd never had to say before. Maybe things got out of hand." It wasn't an apology. People like Rick Blackwell didn't apologize. But it was acknowledgement, which was more than Joe had expected. "Water under the bridge," Joe replied, turning back to his roses. "I hope you folks find a place that suits you better." As Rick walked away, Joe continued his evening routine, tending to his garden in the golden light of sunset. The yard was healing the way gardens do when given proper care and attention. In a few months, new growth would cover the scars, and the beauty that had taken 43 years to create would be restored. But more importantly, the neighborhood was peaceful again. Children played outside without their parents worrying about noise complaints, evening barbecues returned to reasonable volumes, and the simple courtesy that made communities work had been quietly restored. Standing in his garden that evening, Joe Henderson raised his coffee mug in a small salute to the setting sun. Martha would have been proud. Justice, it turned out, was a lot like gardening. It required patience, the right tools, and perfect timing. But when done properly, the results could be absolutely beautiful. The new neighbors who moved in 2 months later were a young couple with a baby and a genuine appreciation for quiet streets and well-maintained yards. Joe welcomed them with homemade cookies and an offer to help with anything they needed. Some lessons, he reflected, were worth teaching. And some teachers were worth learning from.